Mason Carter owned a small grocery store on a busy street. He worked long hours and greeted every customer with a smile. However, Mason had one habit that slowly hurt his business. He always rounded prices up, even for very small amounts. If a total was $9.80, he would calmly say, "Make it $10, please." Most customers noticed, but they said nothing at first. They trusted Mason and believed it was not important. Over time, people started feeling quietly uncomfortable during payments. Some began checking bills more carefully before leaving the store. Others started choosing nearby shops with more exact pricing. Mason noticed fewer customers but blamed rising market competition. He told himself his prices were still fair and reasonable. One evening, an older man named Harold entered the store. Harold was known for his calm voice and thoughtful advice. He bought simple items and paid without asking questions. When Mason gave him a rounded bill, Harold paused slightly. He smiled gently and handed over the extra coins anyway. Then he looked at Mason and spoke in a steady tone. "Do you always round your prices like this?" Mason nodded and said it saved time and small effort. Harold replied softly, "Time saved can cost something greater." Mason laughed lightly and said business was still doing fine. Harold did not argue and simply thanked him before leaving. The next day, Harold returned and bought a loaf of bread. Again, Mason rounded the bill up without much thought. Harold paid again and quietly observed the transaction. This repeated for several days with similar small purchases. Each time, Harold paid without complaint or hesitation. After a week, Harold invited Mason for a short walk. Mason agreed, curious about the old man's calm persistence. They walked toward a small marketplace a few blocks away. Harold pointed at another shop that looked simple but busy. Customers entered and left with relaxed faces and steady trust. He asked Mason to watch how the shopkeeper handled payments. Mason observed carefully and noticed something very specific. The shopkeeper counted every coin with complete accuracy. He returned exact change and explained totals clearly to customers. People thanked him and often smiled before leaving the store. Some even returned quickly for small forgotten items. Mason noticed the difference but still felt unsure inside. Harold then said, "Let us do a small experiment today." He handed Mason a list of simple items to purchase. Mason entered the shop and bought everything on the list. The shopkeeper calculated the bill and spoke the exact amount. Mason paid and received precise change without any rounding. The process felt simple, but something about it felt different. As Mason stepped outside, Harold asked him a question. How did that payment feel inside? Mason thought for a moment before answering honestly. "It felt clear, fair, and respectful," he finally said. Harold nodded slowly and began explaining the real lesson. When money is handled, trust becomes part of every exchange. Even small, unfair changes slowly damage that invisible trust. Mason listened quietly as the meaning became clearer. Harold continued, "People may not complain, but they remember. They may not argue, but they choose where to return." Mason suddenly recalled his recent empty store afternoons. He remembered familiar customers who stopped visiting without explanation. The connection slowly formed in his mind with growing clarity. Harold placed a hand gently on Mason's shoulder. Profit earned without trust always carries a hidden cost. Reputation once damaged becomes harder to rebuild later. Mason lowered his eyes and felt a quiet realization. He understood that small actions had created larger consequences. He had been saving seconds, but losing something far greater. The next morning, Mason opened his store earlier than usual. He adjusted his pricing method and prepared exact change carefully. He also placed a small sign near the counter. It read, "We now return exact change for every purchase." When customers arrived, Mason handled each payment with precision. He counted carefully and returned every coin without rounding. Some customers noticed and exchanged surprised looks with each other. One regular customer smiled and said, "This feels better now." Another customer nodded and stayed longer to browse more items. Days passed, and slowly, familiar faces began returning again. People felt comfortable and started trusting the store once more. Mason continued the practice without fail, even during busy hours. He trained himself to value accuracy over speed or convenience. One evening, Harold returned and bought a small basket of fruits. Mason calculated the bill and returned exact change carefully. Harold smiled and said, "Now your store feels different." Mason replied, "I finally understand what I was losing." Harold nodded and added one final piece of wisdom. Money comes and goes, but reputation stays much longer. Mason thanked him with a sincere and grateful expression. From that day forward, he never rounded prices again. His store grew slowly, but trust grew much stronger. And Mason learned a simple truth through quiet experience. Reputation is priceless, and once lost, it costs everything.